out how to use the MobileFirst services, and especially the Cloudant data backend in a Bluemix app. So let's get started. I'm going to make a few assumptions here, those assumptions are primarily to do with setup and things like that. So I'm going to assume that you know your way around Xcode, that you already got a Bluemix account, and I'm going to use Google Plus for authentication. So I'm going to assume that you have a Google developer account set up as well. To build the actual app that I'm going to build, you will also need to have CocoaPods installed on your Mac. CocoaPods is a dependency manager for iOS and OS X. So I'm going to try and show you the complete, or more or less the complete build of an app that uses Google to authenticate access to a Cloudant database. This uses a Bluemix app as that functions as a proxy for the mobile app, and it uses the Cloudant Toolkit SDK to query a remote database and display the data it gets back in table view. So really we're building three separate apps, or three separate services, if you like. The Bluemix app, which handles the auth and function as a data proxy, and the Google app to function as the OAuth 2 service backend thing. And then, of course, the iOS app that will use these services using Cloudant Toolkit to access the data. So I'm going to dive in. I'm going to set up this app in Bluemix first, and I'm going to configure it to use Google Plus, and I'm going to go into the Cloudant backend and replicate in a known database, so that we have some data that we can talk to. So you go down to applications here, and you press create app, and you choose mobile and iOS 8, and then you get the MobileFirst services starter, and that's what we're going to use. So I'm going to show you how to use these two things here, which is the Cloudant backend and the AMA, the Advanced Mobile Access, which is the authentication stuff. You can call it what you want, provided that the name isn't already taken on Bluemix, which is a challenge. So I'm going to call this Lucky Pig. And then just wait for a bit. Like so. And what we need here is to copy in the bundle ID and the version of the app itself that we will have built. So I've cheated a bit, so I actually have that here, so I can go in and grab that. It's just this bit here. So I'm going to copy this in here. And the version was 1.0, like so. So we get some information on how to kind of bootstrap this stuff when we come to write the actual app. We're going to get back to that in a minute. So now we have it. So we have these services that get added. These are part of the MobileFirst starter kit. We have the AMA, we have the Cloudant backend, and we have the push messaging, which I'm actually not going to get into in this example. So we need to configure these, and in order to configure the AMA to use Google Plus, we need to set up a kind of Google app. And you need a Google developer account in order to do this. So when you have that set up, it's free for the first 60 days. So do register and experiment. You go in, and if you're on the developer console, you can go into Create Project, Lucky Pig, create that. There's a lot of waiting with these things. So what we need to do now is go into the APIs and auth, and then we want to go into APIs and add the Google Plus API to our app, and then enable that. Then we're going to go to credentials and create a new client ID that functions as an installed application. Then we need to set up a consent screen. The consent screen, you can see in a kind of example here to the right of my screen here, it's the screen that get popped up when the app will ask the user to authenticate. You need to configure at least two things: your email address and the product name. You can actually go through the effort of making everything a bit nicer, but those are the two things that you are required to put in. So we can now say that it's an iOS app, and then we have the bundle ID, which was Plucky Pig. We don't have an App Store ID. So now we get this client ID, this long string of numbers and letters. So we copy that, and then we can go back into the AMA setup on Bluemix. Then what we want to do is go into this thing here that says allow unauthenticated access to the backend. We want to make sure that we have authenticated access to the backend using the Google setup, Google Plus that we just set up. And in goes that long string, and we save that. And we get some information on what we need to do in the code in order to make use of this. Yeah, so we'll get back to that. So that's the auth bit done. The other thing that we need to do was the data backend. So if we go back to our app, and then if we look under Show Credentials here in the Cloudant tile, you get some data which is used to which is associated with your account. So if we copy the password for, I'm going to use that in a second, and then click the tile itself, we can go to the Cloudant dashboard that corresponds to this account. And as you can see, we have no data at all, no databases, no anything really. So that's not going to be very interesting. So what we can do here is to replicate in a known database. And I'm going to use one of mine that I have as a remote database. Called Roots. It's a database that contains about 2010 documents, I think. Each document represents a rock climbing route in the Peak District National Park in England. I tend to use this as my demo database. This is open for reading, so if you want to make use of that, feel free. I'm going to replicate that into a local database called Roots into this account. Yeah. Now this will take a little bit of time to complete, but here you need to put in the password that we copied before. So this will get kicked off, and what we need to do then is just wait for a little bit. So there we go. 2010 documents in the database. We can bump into here and have a look at one. Say that one. So we can see it's pretty straightforward. It's got about half a dozen or so fields. The one that we're particularly interested in is a thing called schema, which is the type, the document type. So in the app itself, what we're going to do is put an index on this thing here, and then so that we can fetch all the documents of this particular type, the root type. So I think that's it for it should now be configured to use. And what we're going to do is to start looking at the app itself. But before we do that, we need to get the access credentials for the Bluemix backend that we just have built. So if we go into here, you can see that we have a URL that defines the kind of where this these services will be found, and then a kind of UID that is my key to get in. Yeah, so we're gonna have to put those things into the code. So let's pop into Xcode. So what I've done here is I've installed using the instructions that flashed by in Bluemix. I've installed all the dependencies which are in here, which is the MobileFirst stuff, the Cloudant toolkit, and a few other internal dependencies that's come in. I've created a single view app, and it's got a very, very simple user interface. It's got a single view, which is a table view, and it's got just the subtitle type cell in there. So in the app delegate then, I mean, most of this stuff is basically just boilerplate that you would be advised in code snippets will be chucked up inside Bluemix. I kind of skipped over that bit, but the first thing we need to do is initialize the Bluemix backend that we just created, and that's these two calls here. So we ask for the IMF client singleton, and then we say initialize that with the backend root and backend UID. Yeah. So that's the bit that I just showed you. So let's go and grab those from the Bluemix app. So we have the root, which is the URL for this one here, and then we have the UID, which is this one here. So we put that one in there. So that's the first bit. The next bit is to set up the Google Auth, and there are three things that you need to do. You need to ask for the singleton for the authentication handler and register that with the default delegate, which is the kind of easy way of getting started. And then you need to put in two boilerplate methods, and that's the handling the did become active event, and then deal with a URL call. So, and this is something that it's a custom URL scheme for this app, so that when you kind of delegate out to the Google authentication screen, that you can get back into the app, and that's configured in here. If you go into here and under info, you need to set up a URL type, and that's just the bundle ID again. That goes in there. So once that's done, then Google can call up the app again after the authentication has succeeded, ideally. So going back into here, that's the end of the auth stuff. Yeah. So the next thing we need to do is set up the data backend. And the interesting thing with the Cloudant toolkit is that it provides two ways of dealing with a data backend. You can talk directly to a remote backend, so that's making calls out to the Cloudant backend every time you need to get some data from it, or you can replicate a remote backend locally, and any subsequent call will be to the local database. Now that last approach is probably the one that you would use most of the time, because what that gives you is a very nice kind of offline capable behavior. Once the initial replication has happened, every subsequent access to the database just goes locally to the device. So it works in airplane mode kind of thing. Yeah. And then as a developer, you just need to take care that replications happen whenever there's the connectivity so allows. However, for this example, we've covered those kind of approaches to offline behavior in previous videos like this. So this time I thought I'd just do the remote store, because this is something that is extra compared with the normal CDT data store stuff for Cloudant. So what I'm going to do here is to create a remote store. And the way that you do that is you start off with asking for the manager reference. And the data manager is what manages your data stores. So you can have many data stores, but you can use a single data manager to manage those. And then I'm just setting up a name and the database I created. So that was this thing called routes. So when I create a remote store, I need to do three things. I need to set up the remote store itself, and ideally that succeeds. And if that succeeds, this block is called. If it doesn't succeed, you need to do something about the error, and all I'm doing here is actually logging it. But if this succeeds, I'm storing away the reference to this store in a property that I've got here. So the next thing I need to do is to create an index. And in order to use Cloudant Query, which is the kind of query language to get things out of this thing, we need to set up the indices for the fields that I want to query. So I'm creating an index here called schema for the schema field. And that was the one I pointed at earlier in the database console, which is then the kind of the document type, as it were. And similarly, that gets given a completion handler block and an error that we need to look for. And then the last thing I need to do is to set the permissions. Yeah. So basically what we're saying here is that if a user has managed to authenticate using Google in our case, we will grant that user access to this database. Now these last two, that one and that one, they will only happen on the first time. The first time we do this. Subsequent calls to this, they will just well, the call will go out, but the database was saying, hey, this is already done. So we can afford to do that every time without any kind of real cost. And the way that I'm dealing with this here, so when this setup is done, I'm just posting a kind of global notification saying that the data setup is now complete. That means that the database is ready for use if the view controller or whatever can then start querying for data. So that's that. That's the kind of boilerplate setup. Yeah. With that, we have connected ourselves to the authentication, and we've connected ourselves to the data backend. What we need to do now is just make use of that in some way. And in order to have a nice kind of level of abstraction here, I've created a model class. And all this is doing is just for ease of representation, really. So the only thing that this class will do is it will be initialized from a kind of document to turn it into a kind of Objective-C object. And I'm just picked out the fields from the JSON. So I've got 2 integer fields and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strings. And another thing here that I actually don't use. And the way that's created, I have this in it with revision, and this CDT document revision you may already be familiar with. That's the kind of the kind of base class for documents that came out. So you can think of that as just the unpacked JSON, if you like. Yeah. So all I'm doing here is creating this object with the relevant fields from the body of this document revision. So let's look at the view controller. So the view controller is the bit that's going to populate the interface, and we need to do a few things. I have a little spinner thing, a little activity indicator that just shows that just gives some feedback when the app is busy. So when the view loads, I'm just setting that off to start spinning, and then I have this model dictionary here. So this is the thing that's going to feed the table view. So the way that this will work is that it's a grouped presentation. So each of these routes documents, they have something called a CRAG, which is a CRAG is a kind of a collection of routes. So I'm trying to make a grouped presentation based on the CRAG, and under that all the routes. So the first thing I'm doing then is to listen for this notification that the app delegate sends when it's done, and this is this thing called data setup complete. So when that happens, I'm going to call a method called reload data. And the reload data thing will do a couple of things. It will kick off a Cloudant query, and all that will do is say, hey, give me all documents that has a schema field equals root. And then what it will do is go through the results of that, convert all the documents into this model class root that I've created, and stick those in the relevant place in this dictionary that serves as a model here. So if the root belongs to a crag that I've already seen, I'm just adding that to an array inside that entry in the dictionary. And if it's a new crag that I haven't seen before, I'm just creating that array inside that entry. When that has finished, I'm just making sure that I always execute on the main thread for UI updates. So I'm copying over the, I'm sending over this model into the model dictionary into the property, and I'm telling the table view that job's good one, you can now kind of redisplay it. Then there's the standard stuff of changing the table view data source to take into account how this is done. So the number of sections, that's the number of crags that we've seen, which corresponds to the number of pairs in the dictionary. And the number of rows then is, for a given section, the count of the number of entries in the array that sits under that. The self-wrote index path is the method that basically determines the presentation for each cell. And all I'm doing there is, given the index path, picking out the root that corresponds to that entry and setting the name to be the name of the root and the subtitle little label to be the crag. And the final bit is just the header, the sections really, that's going to be the name of the actual crag that the roots under it belongs to. So it's not really that much to it. It's like a page and a half of code to do that. So let's try it. Right, got some weird timeout there. Let's try that again. See if I see better. So that's we swing in. I'm just going to authenticate here. So what happens is there, and I just accept this app. And there queries the database. You can see in the console down there. Comes the data, and there it comes. Yeah. So in summary, what I did was I set up a Bluemix app to use the MobileFirst services. I created a Google app to handle authentication via Google+, and I wrote a really simple iOS app to talk to these two things and to use an existing database that I replicated into my Cloudant backend, and I used that as a remote database to show in the app. As I pointed out, the best way of doing things like this is probably to talk to and use a local database on the app that you replicate to as your main kind of interaction with the data, such that you'll have an app that works in offline mode as well, which is very important for a good app experience. But we've covered that mode of operation in a previous video, so do check out that if you want to write an app that uses that feature. So thank you very much for listening, and please check back, and we'll be making more of these. So thank you very much.